Serious therapists of Reddit, has a patient ever shared something that was either too much or caused you to question your own life? If so, what was it? I worked with underprivileged patients at an outpatient center in a very poor neighborhood. All of my patients had to be diagnosed with a chronic mental illness in order to qualify for services. One patient I worked with lived in an abusive home. She refused to leave due to cognitive impairments, and there wasn't anything we could do to make her leave. She dealt with many health issues over the few years I worked with her, and eventually was diagnosed with a terminal disease. She passed away 3 months later, but before she passed she said to me, "Some people never get a happy ending, I guess." This really stuck with me because you always hear that it gets better or it will all be okay in the end, but for some people it just doesn't. Edit. Dear Reddit, sorry for depressing you. Please do not use my post as confirmation that your current situation won't get better. My patient was actively working every day to improve her situation, and I fully believe that if she hadn't passed, she would have seen the fruits of her labor. Going through low points in life is normal, but if you feel like you might be dealing with something more serious, please reach out to someone and get professional help. Therapist here. I do a lot of mental health assessments/evaluations rather than long-term therapy. I can't get too specific, but I used to contract for CPS in my state to do evaluations with kids and later moved to a different work setting. Well, one day a year or two later, a woman came in for an evaluation and told me a pretty normal trying to get my life back in order story. But one thing stuck out, that she had caused the death of her child. As we're talking, I realized that I knew who that kid was because of my previous job and had worked with them a few times. I'm glad I didn't make the connection until late in the evaluation, because it definitely threw a wrench me emotionally. I ended up referring the woman out to a different provider afterwards. Holy hell, that's rough, and I can definitely see that being a conflict of interest at the very least. Fucking yikes. Good for you, you must have self-control of steel. It must have been supremely difficult remaining professional in that situation. Therapist here. Difficult to answer this question without getting disrespectfully specific, but I will say I struggle the most with clients whose coping mechanisms have been stuck on blame others for decades. I understand fully how it happens and I have empathy for it, and we can work it together, but sometimes the pattern gets so extreme that clients hurt others. That's when I have the most difficulty as a therapist figuring out what's reportable, very, very little, and how to keep helping someone whose value system has gotten so out of whack that they're willing to hurt other people, and so ferociously stuck on defense that they will not engage in moral injury or trauma work with me. Clients' suicidal thoughts, self-harm, graphic sexual abuse, wild OCD thoughts, light paranoia, none of that phases me anymore. If you're motivated by being worried about being too much, don't be. That's what we're here for. The human brain is whack as hell sometimes, we all need support. As for questioning my own life, absolutely. Therapy is a real two-way street. Things my clients say cause me to reflect on myself and my choices all the time. Usually in very lovely, interesting ways. I wish I could tell you some of the brilliant, thought-provoking things I have heard in sessions. It's such a privilege to do this work. Update: wow, this got a lot of attention. I want to add that I got a lot of folks asking why we're all so cagey with the juicy details. Here's how I responded. Yeah, I think it's really specific to therapy. At the very core of our work is treating our clients' inner worlds as sacred. We literally can't help them if there isn't enough trust, to be honest. So even if a shared detail wouldn't be identifiable, and you're right, it's pretty unlikely, the fact of us coming on our website and spilling these private processes would signal to others, and society as a whole, that we don't deeply respect the almost sacred duty we have to protect what's told to us in session. So, yeah, even if it's not legally a HIPAA violation, you're likely to see therapists being very cagey about discussing their clients. Our respect for their privacy is literally what makes therapy work. Update: I did get more folks asking me how clients have caused me to reflect on myself. Without getting too specific, I will say that I practice what I preach in terms of mindfulness, emotion acceptance, and values-based living, and I am not a perfect person, either. I frequently recognize my clients' all too human processes and myself procrastinating, blaming, checking out instead of deeply engaging, etc. etc. Trying to help folks arrive with presence to their experience of their own life really helps me stay in mine, even when I feel the call to avoid, escape, or otherwise prioritize avoiding pain over living fully. Last update: hey y'all, I appreciate that it feels like I could help you via DM, but that's actually unethical as heck. I can't give you Reddit therapy. If you have a personal question for me on your internal processes, maybe that means you should go talk to a professional. That's actually a better answer than I could have hoped for. Never would have imagined that blaming others would be such a huge obstacle for therapy, but in retrospect that actually makes perfect sense. That's actually a better answer than I could have hoped for. Never would have imagined that blaming others would be such a huge obstacle for therapy, but in retrospect that actually makes perfect sense. I volunteer at a suicide hotline. I'm not a registered therapist, but I have some formal training that a therapist might employ on a regular basis. Namely, tools and strategies to empathize, listen, make people feel heard, and carry out risk assessments to gauge whether an individual is at risk for a suicide attempt. Generally, I don't regard anything as oversharing. However, there are men who frequently abuse the service for sexual pleasure. They get off on sharing their fetishes with women. I'd say our hotline is about 80% women, and some people take advantage of that. They don't outright share, they disguise it. I'm depressed that my wife is going to leave me. It's all my fault. I hate myself, what's the point of living? Well, tell me what you mean. Well, you see, it's very private. It's hard to talk about. Very normal, when talking about something that stresses you out to the point of taking your life. You work on building trust and rapport, and then they come out with some outlandish sexual fetish like being fucked with heels, incest scenarios. The response is just to explain that we don't talk about sexual matters in depth like this. Recommend seeing a therapist or counselor, and then drop the call. Men who are obsessed with sex are annoying to begin with. But then you call a frigging suicide hotline where people get put on hold because we don't have enough volunteers, and you just wanted to call us to jerk off. I started volunteering specifically because I found out that there are hold times. Isn't that terrible? Someone who is suicidal should immediately be connected to a caring and trained individual. We do the best we can, but we definitely need more people. I have no patience for these jerks anymore. Sometimes I disconnect without so much as providing an explanation. How utterly pathetic and selfish. You'd rather indulge in your fetish than allow someone suicidal to get connected with the help they need. Therapist here. I worked in a county jail for several years. I mostly did assessments and booking, so I saw people freshly arrested. Some were high on drugs, some unmedicated mentally ill, gangbangers, you name it, I've seen it. One case was a woman in her 40s, who was trafficked from Asia in her teens for sex, addicted to meth, with a man who beat her constantly. She was arrested for domestic violence. Had visible bruises on her person. I sat with her for a while as she recounted the years of abuse by this man. She cried. I offered her support, validation, resources in the community, and told her I would check in with her the following day. She reached for my hand and said thank you through her tears. After I sat with her, I went to my office and cried a guttural, raw cry indicating that something had stirred within me. I was in a physically abusive relationship years earlier that I thought I had processed and overcome. And I worked with many women who were victims of DV over the years. But something about her story and the way she said thank you, she had not shared much of her experience with anyone, stayed with me. I was still not done dealing with my own trauma from being in an abusive relationship. I went back to therapy shortly after seeing this woman. I hope she's out there, doing well and safe. Can't go into specifics because of privacy laws, but while training I was given cases that definitely made me grateful. My master's program requires all of us to have a therapist of our own because while it wasn't a story I hadn't heard before, just the amount of patients I have who have either committed the same heinous acts or who have had the same heinous acts committed upon them gets me down after a while. That's also when I know I need to catch that unhealthy burnout before it happens because that's also dangerous. A supervisor of mine shared this story with me. At the time she was working in a rural area where she grew up and she specializes in trauma. Her father was involved in a car accident and died on the scene. Not long after she gets a referral for a new client. In the session the client tells her that they are a paramedic and experiencing trauma. They start describing in detail a horrific crash they attended where someone died at the scene. Turns out this was the paramedic who attended her father's death. She had to stop the session and refer them on. She shared this story with me after I struggled through an hour of trying to counsel a woman who had just experienced her 5th miscarriage while I was 7 weeks pregnant. The moral of the story was that we are humans too and it's okay to refer on. I have to keep it non-specific for privacy reasons, but the answer overall is not really, or at least not from a patient. While many of the individuals I've worked with are struggling, and some have done pretty awful things in their past, the beauty of therapy is that you get to see them as a full and nuanced person. You don't agree with or feel good about their negative decisions, especially when those choices impacted other people, but you're able to better understand how they ended up there. That being said, There have been some times when I was damn near ready to throw in the towel. The first time was during one of my early clinical jobs, working in a short-term inpatient child crisis unit. Needless to say, we met with a lot of kids who had gone through seriously bad shit, no small portion of which had parents involved in some form. It was tough to work with parents who had been complacent when it came to abuse, or even perpetrated it, but even then I was able to see them more holistically in a way that was helpful. While they made bad parenting decisions, many of those folks were themselves struggling with mental health challenges or histories of being abused themselves. They needed support, but they had the capacity to be good parents. Then there was one case that broke that mold. I wasn't the primary therapist on the case, but at times helped out my coworker, who to her credit had saint-like patience with this family. The kid was very sweet, but the parents were two of the nastiest people I've ever met. They had divorced, and were using custody as a cudgel to try to punish each other, to the point where both had made false abuse claims against their former spouse. The poor kid was essentially growing up in the middle of an emotional war zone, and his parents knew that. But neither was willing to try to even shield their child from their behavior. They outright made the decision that they would do permanent psychological harm to their child than lose the divorce process, which at that point had been going on for years. I'm glad I wasn't in the lead on that one, because it's one of the few cases where I feel I wouldn't have been able to maintain my common session. More recently I took a job in healthcare, working mostly with elderly folks and those with physical disability. Many of those folks have problematic behaviors or life histories, but again that doesn't make the job difficult for me. Instead, being up close and personal with the healthcare system is what has been hardest for me. Seeing people who did nothing wrong, and who have a clear path to recovery, lose everything because of how inflexible insurers can be is infuriating. I work with so many people who are stuck in our facility, which is highly medicalized, just because their income post-medical payment doesn't actually let them afford accessible housing back in the community. They're ready to go, and it costs taxpayers hundreds of thousands a year to have them stay in our building, but because some asshole legislator limited how much money they can collect a month while getting treatment, they become trapped for years. It's literally a situation where regulations save a few $1,000s per person in the short term, while costing hundreds of times more in the long term. Even worse still are the people who did the right things before getting sick, like finding private insurance or saving diligently. The private insurance companies are absolute scum, and jump at any chance to discharge people home, no matter how bad an idea we tell them this is. If the discharge technically meets the criteria for being safe, the private companies don't give a fuck about the concerns of the treatment team, they just want to save their money. I've literally had cases where I was released that privately insured folks ended up needing to return to the hospital from our facility, as I worry that there's a decent chance they would have just died at home if they discharged like the insurance companies wanted. On the savings side, we don't talk enough as a country about the huge gap between qualifying for supports like Medicaid and actually being able to afford medical services. I've worked with folks who made/saved more than the insanely low bar set by Medicaid, but who could by no means afford to pay even for the co-pays their insurance asked of them. For many they had to essentially watch their life savings dwindle to nothing, often losing their homes in the process, before applying for the Medicaid benefits we knew they were going to need from day one. Therapist here. I can't say that anyone has ever overshared with me in a way that had me questioning my career choice. If anything, it's annoying when my clients don't share enough relevant information. I feel like they have wasted their time and money on our sessions and I feel bad. I think every therapist has a niche clientele that they enjoy and feeds their life joy, as well as vice versa. I will never work with kids because 95% of the time, it's the parents. I also find that couples who have been married forever are also exhausting to me, so I try to avoid them as much as I can. However, I love working with people who are in the middle of life transitions as well as people experiencing spiritual issues. Anxiety disorders are also super easy to treat quickly. I have had a few situations that have been unsettling/disturbing. One was a parent/child combo where the parent would actively sabotage child's effort to grow up and mature. I remain convinced that the parent had to be the very definition of evil. There was either sociopathy or psychopathy at play there. Another one was when a sex offender had begun to profile me as a victim while in session. I quickly ended the session, spoke to my boss about it, and never saw him again. I began Krav Maga lessons shortly afterwards to ensure I never felt so helpless again. All of this being said, I love my job and I can't imagine doing anything else that would bring me as much fulfillment. Therapist here, worked inpatient quite a few years, and there is literally nothing that is too much you can share or say. I've about heard it all. I often joke about this, as clients occasionally ask if they are too much or giving too many details. The only time I've asked a client to pull up is with some unnecessary sexual details that weren't pertinent to the situation, and with that, it was done very kindly with thought. So often my clients cause me to find meaning more in my own life. I left practicing as an individual therapist for some time as I was burned out on the system and shitty management, basically tyrant bosses, and people who needed care not getting it. I went back to practicing again 3 months ago after almost leaving the field, and it's really brought so much warmth to my heart. I have a job where people trust me enough to share fears, worries, things they haven't even shared with their best friends or partners. And they let me push, and question, and guide them to find their own version of healing. It's really a gift to have folks let you in on that process. Psychologist here. It's an interesting question to think about. There have definitely been patients who have pushed my buttons, but that's in the sense of unexpectedly making me angry. There have also been things that have been really disturbing or sad or whatever, but none of those things really were too much or anything. That's why I'm there, after all, and I appreciate being able to do that. There's two ways that I could identify things that might address the question. One is that sometimes the sheer volume of ways in which society has kind of screwed people over, or people screw each other over, gets to be a bit difficult to cope with. Or after a while knowing all the random crazy stuff that happens, accidents, natural disasters, viruses, etc., makes me a bit paranoid sometimes. But those aren't really about a single client or patient, it's more about them in aggregate over the years, or about what's happened to them over the years. There have been a couple of times in which a patient's relationship problems were similar to ones I was going through at the time. I don't know that it got to be too much, but in retrospect I don't know how much my reactions to those patients' situations were being affected by my own experiences at the time, for example, by making assumptions about what was going on, or being biased towards certain explanations over others. There's different levels at which therapists process their reactions to sessions or cases. One is just the reaction per se, like that shook me emotionally, or I often feel irritated by that client, or that thing they said really stuck with me. Another is why you feel that way. Is it about you? Are other people feeling that way toward them? Hey, so I'm the son of a therapist. My mom used to specialize in helping parents who lost a child get through the grieving process. One day a good amount of years back, my mom came home crying and told me about parents who had a child with terminal cancer who was given the choice to live a few months longer but stay hospitalized, or go back home with his family but have a much higher chance of dying quicker. The little boy, who was given a choice that nobody should make, decided to die at home with his family instead of going through pain at the hospital just to live longer. I was in middle school at the time when my mom told me that story, and it blew my mind. It inspired me in an odd way and made me appreciate my family and my life a lot more. My mom started a foundation named Nico's Promise in honor of that little boy. It helps families like that every day, so I'm very proud of it. Sorry for the bad grammar, I'm not the best writer.